Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit. This is a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Eddie Boon. I'm here in East London, where I'm based, serving the Thames North Synod of the United Reformed Church as their discipleship enabler. It's a real privilege to be hosting this podcast in this season. We've had so many great conversations. I'm sure today will be no different. So today's guest is Genesis Padgett. Welcome to you, Genesis.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are and what your responsibilities are?
Yeah, so currently I'm the youth president of the Methodist Church in Britain. So that involves me traveling around the whole of the UK, really, visiting different youth groups, meeting young people, and getting their voices heard around all of the UK and really involved in the church. I'm a local preacher on trial in the Barnsley circuit in Sheffield. I'm currently volunteering for the Exodus project, which is for children and youth in deprived areas around Barnsley and Wakefield. For those who might be struggling with poverty or who are struggling with their mental health, anything like that, we help with.
That's brilliant, brilliant. A local preacher on trial. That sounds really, really scary in the Methodist Church.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's not too bad. Most people are lovely. I only get a
yeah,
few criticisms.
yeah. Good, good. I'm glad about that. Oh, bless you in that ministry. And today's JPIT member on the podcast is Erica Lee Smith, who is JPIT's communications intern. But not for much longer, Erica. I believe this is your last recording of the podcast. Oh, you've done a fantastic job over the last, how long have you been doing it? Is it a year?
Yeah, since September last year. So yeah, it's coming up to a year now.
Have,
But yeah, it's my final recording, which is very strange.
have you got any closing thoughts on the time?
Um, I guess it's just really consolidated for me that politics belongs in the pulpit.
Well done for your work on the podcast, and thank you for your encouragement to me as host. So, Genesis, how do you see? Obviously, you're involved in preaching locally around different churches, presumably in the Methodist circuit. How do you see politics fitting and integrating with the preaching ministry?
It can be quite difficult to kind of walk that line of politics and preaching. Because obviously you can't put your political views into the minds of others. You can't be forcing people to think. For instance, if I was say I was a Labour voter or anything, I can't be telling everyone you've got to vote for Labour. The Tories suck. But you can really address moral and social issues if and when they relate to the gospel. Um, and I reckon, preaching about homelessness or poverty or climate change is okay, because they're profoundly biblical concerns, something like that. But more on the idea of your political standing is it shouldn't belong in the pulpit itself.
Mm. Yeah, it's the answer. We tend, and all our guests tend to talk about politics and the whole of life, as opposed to sort of tribal, narrow politics. That it's not always easy, as you say, to walk that line. And part of our discussion today is all about that. And
Absolutely. And I think if
yeah,
you preach the gospel clearly enough so that people can discern the implications for public life, then that works really well. But obviously you've got to do it humbly enough that people can remain, well, free to arrive at their own political conclusions there.
yeah. Yeah, don't want to teach Methodists about the concept of prevenient grace, but this idea that it's, God working quietly in the background through a lot of these things, and maybe that supports what you're saying about not sort of necessarily hitting people over the head with one narrow view, but being faithful to the word and being faithful to God as well. So.
Of course.
So, before we look at the text and have a chat through some of them, just a few things going on in the news, just to remind you that we're talking about Sunday, the 30th of August, And in the news at the moment that there have been vigils, hundreds of people attending vigils in Cambridge and London following the tragic death of academic Jason Arday. There are growing protests continuing as the oil and gas industry urges Andy Burnham to approve some North Sea drilling this week. The really interesting story of Sainsbury's, which has paused its use of AI facial recognition software in their cameras after falsely flagging a shoplifter and telling them they couldn't shop there. And finally, Reform UK proposes £50 billion pounds worth of cuts from the welfare budget if they come into government. There's some of the things that are floating around in today's news. 30th of August, when these lectionary passages are likely to be looked at. It is actually also the Greenbelt Festival. Let It All Go is the theme, and all three of us are attending that in various roles and responsibilities. And it may well be that some of our themes and our passages will fit with all that will be going on at that festival as well. So let's start dipping into the passages. We've got, you'll find the details of all the verses in the bio of the podcast. So I'll just mention what the chapters are. We've got Exodus 3. We've got Psalm 105. That is quite a long passage. We've got Romans chapter 12, and we've got Matthew chapter 16. And then we do have two alternative passages that some preachers may reflect on, and that's Jeremiah 15 and Psalm 26. So let's get stuck into the word now. Genesis, which out of those four main passages would you go to start with, do you think, today?
I'd probably go to the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 16.
This whole taking up your cross, what might that have to say for believers today in terms of justice and life generally? I wonder, what do you think?
Well, I think in the passage of Matthew, Jesus is revealing that his mission will lead to suffering and rejection, the cross even symbolizing death. And Jesus says, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So that's really all about surrendering your self-interest, uh, losing your life in order to find it with Jesus, being in heaven, trusting God's purposes really rather than human priorities. And I think that's the big main one there, trusting God's purposes rather than human priorities. If we're looking in the news, there was those climate protests. Obviously, that's a very human part there, and it's all about creating the human priorities and getting more oil. And I know that the oil price is skyrocketing at the moment. I mean, fuel's even more expensive than it used to be when it was up last time. But actually, I personally, I believe that should we be doing that? Probably not. Should we be urging Andy Burnham to approve this just so we can get more money? I wouldn't approve it, because that is all about human priorities. Because it's devastating for the environment, and that money isn't going towards helping the homeless, or helping those who are struggling with mental health, or helping those young people who are in poverty around. That's all about making more money for those who are already got plenty. So that's really nothing to do with God's purpose or God's plan for your life. That's all really for how can we become greedy? How can we get even more than we have while people are struggling? That's the big one for me there, Eddie.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
It's fascinating. Last week, I think we were looking at Peter's confession of faith and being called, and then immediately afterwards in today's passage, we've got this whole emphasis of Peter rebuking Jesus, and that's always quite again another harsh saying of Jesus, where he rebukes Peter, and a reminder that power, something that isn't God's agenda, it can be called out in the way that Jesus seems to be doing here with Peter.
Absolutely, especially with the harsh words of "Get behind me, Satan" there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mm,
Just adding on to what you were saying there, and how he continues to say, "You're a stumbling block for me." This is one of
yeah,
Jesus' most trusted, most beloved disciples.
yeah,
He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me." Because it's
yes,
that same thing as he says later on. He says, "You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He's not following God's plans. He's following his
yeah,
own earthly. No, I love you, Jesus. I don't want you to die. That very selfish idea there.
yes. And that's really that sort of ambiguous. He's already said, "I'm going to build my church on this rock," and now he's suggesting that Peter can be a stumbling block. And isn't that a challenge to all Christians? Really, are we something that God's building upon, or are we a stumbling block to
mm.
to others? Erica, what's your thoughts of what we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are a really interesting set of passages, and I think Genesis touched on an aspect which I was definitely planning to pick up kind of throughout the readings, particularly in Exodus, actually, but relating to kind of the earthly versus the divine, and particularly in relation to our attitudes to the environment and everything that's going on at the moment, and the Stop Rosebank campaign, particularly. Is one that JPIT has been supporting consistently for the last year or so, and is a really critical moment as we record today. It's the last day of the public consultation, so it's really important that we're addressing this, in light of that, and talking about the pressure that we need to keep putting on our government to stop the approval for the new drilling licenses. But I think, yeah, I was reflecting also about kind of the language of materialism that you get from this. I know that's not necessarily the direction that everyone will go in. A lot of the time it will be, well, we don't want to look at material things like, technology or whatever, because we're focusing on God's plan for our lives. And while I think, there's so many kind of non-political interpretations of this, I think the political ones are really valuable. So I think you can talk about kind of the sacrifices that you can be making in creating a life which isn't just about the human, is about God's plan, and is about kind of the future of the planet and the other people on the planet, and both now and in the future, and how we make decisions as individuals within our capacity, within our own kind of budgets and everything, in order to build that kind of life and those values into your life. Even though JPIT is often talking about kind of systemic change, I think those are really interesting questions that you get from this passage about, denying yourself, and addressing kind of the privilege that you have as an individual in whatever situation you're in to kind of take action. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was kind of, this language of kind of profits and gain, and giving, and kind of the money side that you can kind of pick up on a little bit, and the idea that these things, money and wealth, ultimately doesn't bring life, and that this is actually quite a radical thing for Jesus to be saying, and it made me think about some of the campaigns recently around wealth taxation, and how we address the people, the class that we have in our society of kind of billionaires and multimillionaires who do have this wealth, which is not necessarily going to bring them life, and is also they are missing out on opportunities to share that wealth with the people that really need it. So yeah, there's some of the things that I got from the Matthew passage.
Yeah, and the brutal reality, I don't know, either of you may think of this, is that in Matthew 16 we have like the power, a cruel um, execution method, which is, it becomes the emblem of the Christian faith. That is the cross.
Mm.
It's a Roman instrument of state execution, and not only is Jesus, this passage is we're moving towards Jerusalem now, and all that's going to go on there, and we get a foretaste of this in this conversation about following the way of the cross. And I sometimes think, it is sacrificial. It's not sacrificial in the sense of just being performative and
Mm.
for the sake of it, aren't I great because I'm
Yeah.
suffering sort of thing. But at
Mm.
its heart like a Christ likeness, I suppose, isn't it? You can't seek to be like Christ unless you are also seeking to be like him in his path to the cross. It's that, I mean, it's not one of our passages, but Philippians 2, doesn't it, makes that clear. How, how do we see that the cross being such a focus in terms of how we are seeing the world? Because it's in the face of brutal, sometimes elected regimes or sometimes unelected, that are pretty brutal and harsh on people, and sometimes trying to rival the Roman way of doing things. And here we have it's called out, isn't it? It's revealed. We're going to put you on show and on trial, if you like, by
Mm.
submitting ourselves to it, and that's a really radical cultural thing to do.
And I think kind of that with the Romans passage, it says, bless those who persecute you,
Oh,
bless and do
yes.
not curse them. And I think we can sometimes get so caught up in our own ideologies and our own ideas, and that often we forget that it's not the people who believe differently to us, who,
Mm,
people who they've got their own opinions, and we've got to celebrate that, I think, rather than, hating the fact that they agree or that they're a part of something that we disagree with. Because sometimes, maybe we think they're evil, whatever, but actually they sometimes may think they're doing the right thing, because you can't make everybody happy. And no matter what you do, people will always be, some people will always be complaining no matter what.
mm,
So I think for us as Christians, it doesn't have to be truly about us suffering, but actually I think for us to follow the cross, it should also be about how can we give to those who are suffering.
yeah.
'Cause I think people get so
Mm.
focused on that, pick up your cross and follow me, do this till death. But actually, it says in Romans as well, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink.
Mm,
That's
Yeah.
that other people will suffer, that it's life, people suffer. How can we help those who are suffering just as we would hope when we're suffering as
mm.
Christians, people would come to our aid?
Yeah,
Mm.
it's a real baseline for a Christ-like community, isn't it? To act ethically, I suppose. And it's so hard today in today's sort of polarized, tribal, where people use social media to get clicks by being as outrageous and as hateful as they possibly can. And therefore, how as Christians, and I don't just mean social media, I mean, some newspapers as well, where
Mm.
it's all about what their profit. And again, this goes back to power, what we were speaking about earlier. Actually, be behind this outrageous discourse is quite often money and power, isn't it? People make money of um, of hatred. Um,
Yeah.
That seems to be the big focus around the world, doesn't it? Everything's to do with money. Absolutely everything. You can't live without it. All of that, which I think links to what we were seeing about the news headlines was your reform was proposing that it was 50 billion, wasn't it? The welfare cut. Those are people who
Mm.
are already struggling. 50 billion pounds cut from that for those on benefits. It's going to struggle even more. Um,
mm,
so that links to, what I was saying earlier is, yeah, people will be struggling. It all does come down to money. How can we give generously in a way that doesn't make us suffer, but makes us follow the cross in that way of peace and of supporting and of helping
mm,
without
Mm.
without also putting anger against those who do support reform.
Yeah.
because not everyone will understand it perfectly what reform's seeing. Not everyone will read the news. So actually, how can you stand up there and preach about tithings to those who are struggling, who's maybe on benefits, without saying in the pulpit that, potentially, reform's the devil's spawn? Because obviously you can't say
Yes.
anything like that. You've got to keep the mind open. You've got to still preach love, kindness, whilst also
Yeah.
Mm.
supporting those who are having real life issues because of them.
Yeah. I don't know what you
Yeah.
think, Erica, but one more angle might be it going into this in terms of treating people as people, which is what we have in Romans 12, isn't it? We have they're
Mm.
described. I think reform over the last 2 or 3 weeks have been repeatedly challenged in the media about, well, what kind of person are you saying will be cut out of the budget? And they are pretty weak on it because they want to dehumanize and they want to, if you like,
Mm.
just talk about the money that's saved without having to say, well, it could be this person with a mental health need or that person. They refuse to do so, and that's really dangerous. And Romans
Mm.
12 actually describes people and the needs of people. How do you see things,
Mm.
Erica?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely kind of want to pick up on some of what you both said about in terms of responding to people like supporters of reform and their, proposals recently. Also recognizing that Nigel Farage has recently won back his seat as an MP, and that there was still like a huge proportion of the constituency which chose to vote for him despite all of these accusations which have been brought to him, things which are known to be true, as well as things which he's been accused of. Also, I suppose, thinking about one of the things that I have learned, I'd say, throughout the course of this year, my work for JPIT, is particularly in terms of engaging with people who think differently. And JPIT is really strong on that and trying to emphasize that it's really important to engage across difference, and particularly in this time that we're living in of such great polarization. And in the context, thinking back to kind of December time, we had the Tommy Robinson protests, and that was a really tense time where some groups who were feeling very fairly like they were being threatened by the Unite the Kingdom marches were coming out and forming counter protests. And kind of what is our response as Christians to that? And I think the verse in Romans, to bless those who persecute you, is one that I've really, really wrestled with this year, and continue to wrestle with. And I'm not sure that many people really have an answer to it. But it's so difficult to do in practice. Like it's lovely in principle, but to actually implement consistently into how your attitudes are towards these kind of groups of particularly extreme ideologies, and still being able to kind of live peaceably with all, and overcome evil with good and turn the other cheek and all this kind of thing that we're being called to. But then equally, I would say that there is part of this passage which says, you should hate what is evil. And, how do we engage with those ideas in the most constructive kind of Christian way? And I think it's only right that I should mention the Better Story conference that is coming up in October. If
Mm.
anyone is interested in attending, I really encourage you to get tickets. And JPIT is helping to organise that in kind of a coalition of various kind of Christian organisations. And it's called Love Thy Neighbour. So it's exploring very much these kind of themes of how we,
Yeah.
love people who disagree with us, whether it's across faith, across ideology, particularly with the far right, and all those kind of themes which have been emerging over the past year. So I'd really encourage you to get tickets for that if you're available. But yeah, all of those themes really. I think it's a very challenging passage. Yeah.
Yeah, to try not to be silent, but try not to be just playing the same games of power and tribalism.
Yeah.
There was a Church of England course, I think it was called the Difference course or something. I think it was a former Archbishop of
Yeah.
Canterbury that uh, got a little bit of traction, but I think it's something we really struggle with. This will have obviously tomorrow night there's a Better Story event on AI, conspiracy theories, and the Christian and the far right as well in London.
Yeah.
That will be well over by the time this podcast goes out. But we're trying our best, but handling differences is so tough. And maybe the Exodus passage we could take a quick look at now. Here's someone like Moses whose life has been saved, who was vulnerable in terms of you know a mass killing, a sort of genocide that was going on, and then he discovers his purpose in his identity in this burning bush experience. What might that have to teach us about what we're talking about today?
I think that God always hears
Mm,
the suffering of those who are struggling or being oppressed. And in Exodus 3, God says, I've observed the misery of my people, I've heard their cry. And sometimes it feels like God can be distant,
yeah,
but actually he's always with us. He hears our cries, he hears our prayers. And I would say that when God sends Moses back to challenge Pharaoh, who is obviously the embodiment of oppression, of exploitation, um, it really it's not really challenging evil with evil. It's more about just challenging whatever diminishes dignity, really. And I think this really echoes the Methodists or John Wesley's concern for those who are poor or the enslaved people at the time or exploited workers or something that's really something that I'm really passionate about is children in poverty. And God's heartbeat is always towards those whose voices are hurt or whose voices who are suffering, who we can hear. And I think when this is God's idea, him sending Moses to Pharaoh. It's not Moses saying, God, let me go to Pharaoh. I want to fight all this. It's God working through someone who believes, someone who is fearful of God. Not fear as in, on my days it's God. It's more of a, I'm ready to obey. And God says, I've observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. And Moses was there. He was raised as an Egyptian, and he's seen that, and he never battled that injustice. It wasn't until he was with God, until he'd met God, until he was loved, shown he was loved by God, that he was actually ready to go and lead them to the promised land.
yeah, yeah. And I'm no expert on Moses, but there are various points in his life where he accepts that he's quite a weak and vulnerable person. He's not really a great speaker, is he? And
Mm.
goes through a lot of difficult times. But like you say, he was there. It was his patch, if you like, through this strange narrative that put him in this place where he was able to get a word in, but he backed it up with action, didn't he? He was willing to speak out, but then when the response, and this is obviously beyond today's passage, but where it starts is feeling things and seeing things perhaps more as God sees them. If God hears the cries of his people, then how can Christians not? There's a basic question for this particular Sunday. What do you think, Erica? You're nodding away.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It was a kind of lens that I hadn't really thought of in this particular passage. So that's really helpful. I think I've been thinking and reflecting quite a bit on what my particular role is within kind of the political space and what I'm called to do and all those kind of questions. And I think sometimes, yeah, the kind of Moses doubt of like, who am I to be leading this or doing these kind of various political, demonstrations or leading a campaign or anything like that. But actually, we all have responsibility to get involved and in these movements towards change. And actually, God sees you through all of that, which, yeah, that's really nice. But I think I was also, yeah, I couldn't get away from the kind of eerily striking link for me when reading this passage in the context of the climate crisis that we are experiencing very much in the UK this summer. We've just had our fifth heat wave, and yeah, I've been really struggling with it in the last couple of weeks, particularly, and how we should feel about that, and kind of wrestling with the sort of climate anxiety and how we emotionally get through this, and what we're called to do. And I think, the sense that the place on which you are standing is holy ground was a line which really stood out for me. The idea that the earth is holy ground, and that we've actively been ignoring this, and we've not been taking care of it. We've not been respecting, our land, which we were called to steward and look after, and live in harmony with. And then, it's the biblical images of abundance of land with milk and honey, good crops and harvest, really sharply contrasts what we are living through at the moment, with 70% of the UK being in drought and the predicted worst cereal harvest this autumn for 4 decades. I think it's, the cries that God is hearing of the suffering is very present today, and remains, so relevant with these readings that are obviously about a very different context, but there's so many similarities, and yeah, it's really difficult to navigate. But the being able to recognize that God is speaking through that, and that God can speak through the fires, hopefully, and begin to wake people up. Maybe that's something that we could take from this passage as well.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And in that passage, there's this revelation of who Moses is, as you said, and the purpose and his calling, but also there's a glimpse of who God is, and God refuses to be like put in a box and pinned down. I am who I am. The name that they were so holy that wasn't really spoken as a name. And that, as every week when we're on this podcast, we're talking about how like the faith interacts with obedience. You mentioned your project up in Yorkshire, called the Exodus Project. So that's clearly you're clearly thinking along this sort of liberation line for the young people that you're working with. Any thoughts on that, Genesis?
Absolutely. With something like the Exodus Project, it's not really about getting revenge, or for those who are struggling, it's neither is it hostility with those who are those who might be in those spaces of anger. Because what we try and teach really is that God is hearing your cries. God is hearing the cries of the vulnerable, and God works through these amazing people to challenge systems and all of these places that are diminishing the human dignity, as we were saying earlier. And He still calls us to follow the way of the cross there, by overcoming the evil with good. No matter what's happened in your life, no matter what struggles you've had, what we teach the young people is that Christ-like love is built in action, is built in those helping others, and actually using your past experience, things that you have struggled with, things you've dealt with in your life, the trauma that you've had. Actually, how can you use your experience to help those who are going through it at the moment? So it's that really God is there. He's hearing your cries. How can you help hear the cries of others who are vulnerable right now?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I really wish that project well in your continued work with them.
Thank you.
Any final points from any of these passages? Final thought? Am I allowed to say that we wouldn't recommend lighting of fires as visual aids for Exodus 3 in our services on this particular Sunday? But that goes without saying, doesn't it? But there's a
Did
sense
you
in
get
which,
the alert on Friday, Eddie?
yeah, scared the living daylights out of me.
Yeah.
I got it on three separate occasions. My phone buzzed three times, that big
Mm,
alarm, three separate
yeah.
times over the course of an hour.
Even that's all been
Must be
kicking
cold.
off, hasn't it? About, oh, is this appropriate use? Is this costing money? And
Yeah.
it feels like the discourse. Everyone's got an angle on anything, and I think we've mentioned this on the podcast quite a few times. Pray for people who are elected because it's such a tough,
Mm.
these decisions. You are going to anger and upset people, whatever you do, and maybe there's that in our passages about the cost of doing the right thing. Sometimes you can do the wrong thing, and it can
Mm.
still be costly. It's about discernment. Leave us with one thought, Genesis, from what you've been saying and showing that you'd like to leave with us as we draw this podcast to an end.
I think it's something that I've been sharing pretty much throughout this whole conversation is that love those, even those whom you may dislike, or who you see are doing wrong or harmful things. Really, that love those Christ-like love, show it in your actions, show it in all that you do. Follow the cross, not by suffering, but by helping those who are suffering.
Mm.
Mm.
That's fantastic, and thank you so much, Genesis, for being with us, and we wish you well in your continued ministry with the Methodist Church and your role with the youth presidency. And thank you for sharing today, and thank you, Erica, and best wishes to you as your time with JPIT comes to an end. So thank you to you both. And thank you for listening to this podcast. We do hope that this episode helps us with our preaching preparation. And if you enjoyed this episode, then please do leave a review wherever you do listen to your podcasts. And please do share this episode with your friends. We'll also have online spaces where you can engage further and discuss faith and politics on our social media platforms. So thank you. And from Politics in the Pulpit, goodbye.